All right, so welcome to another deep dive. Today we are looking into something pretty different and pretty fascinating for me personally. I mean, anytime we look at a transcript of a hypnotic regression, I'm so intrigued by kind of the information and insights we can get. And today we're going to be looking at one titled Upozorowash Huasno Smierć Sesio Regresina Eugenie
Yeah.
from the channel Hypnoza Zapisi Sesci. And I think, anytime we kind of go into these deeper levels of consciousness, I think it's really, really valuable to understand the kind of emotional state and kind of issues of the person being regressed. So that's kind of what we are going to be diving into today.
Yeah, I mean, anytime we're dealing with these really unique sources, I think there's so much that we can glean in terms of, understanding not just the person in the transcript or in the video, but also, ourselves. Because, I mean, I don't know about you, but reading through this transcript, I definitely felt a lot of things resonated with me and my own experiences, and I think that that's really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And right away in the transcript, I mean, the facilitator kind of points out this internal dreaminess of Eugenia, and it's almost like it's clashing with her external reality, and this is paired with, really deep sadness, but there's this underlying beauty that's present. And, it really made me think about, what could be causing this disconnect, and what is this beauty that's still shining through despite, the sadness.
Right. And I think that that contrast is really interesting, having that internal dreaminess and kind of being, in that state, but then also being faced with the reality of the external world. It makes you wonder what exactly is causing that misalignment. And the fact that there's still that beauty present, I think is so key here. It suggests that, there's this core of Eugenia that isn't being completely suppressed,
Yeah,
even with all the difficulties and challenges that she's facing.
absolutely. And there's this longing, this
Mhm.
yearning that she's experiencing as well. It's like something is missing, and it's almost like something inside of her is really wanting to come out, and to experience her full potential, but it's being kind of consumed from within by these intense emotions. Um, and it's powerful. I mean, I think we've all probably felt that at one time or another.
Yeah. And that description of being consumed from within, makes me wonder, is it something that she feels is being lost or stifled?
Yeah.
It definitely points to, I think, some significant struggle that's happening within her, and I think that a lot of people can relate to that.
Yeah, and then we start to see some of the deeper emotions kind of coming up, like despair and fear, and she has this resistance to losing something. Although at this point in the transcript, it's still not really clear what exactly she's afraid of losing.
Yeah.
But these seem like these deeper layers of emotion that are just kind of building on top of that initial sadness.
Yeah.
What could that resistance be tied to?
Yeah. I mean, I think about that resistance and, potentially it could be linked to that yearning that we were just talking about. Maybe she senses that fulfilling this longing might require her to let go of something else, and that prospect is frightening to her, or maybe it could be tied to something in her past that we haven't even uncovered yet. But definitely these emotions point to kind of a more profound level of distress than just sadness, or just kind of general unhappiness.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that the transcript mentions her trying to address this. She's trying new things, engaging in life,
Hmm.
but these efforts don't really seem to be getting to the root of the problem. This longing is still there, and it's almost like she's putting a small bandage on a much deeper wound.
Right. And it really reminds me of, how we try to fill these voids with external things. We think, oh, if I, achieve this, or if I get this, then I'll be happy. But, that relief is often very temporary, and, it never really addresses the root cause. And I think that Eugenia's case really highlights that, because these substitutes just aren't working for her.
Yeah, and these aren't just abstract feelings
Mm.
that she's dealing with her subtle self, and maybe we should talk about what that means real quick. But her subtle self is really experiencing this fear and despair within her physical body, and to me that just shows the connection between our emotional and physical states, how strong it is.
Absolutely. And I think that, it's really important to define the subtle self here because, when we're talking about hypnotic regression, subtle self is often, thought to be this intuitive or energetic part of a person, and it can kind of hold these deeper awarenesses than the conscious mind. And so, it's a way of kind of tapping into feelings and experiences that we might not normally have access to.
That makes sense. And so to kind of go back to that, her subtle self is experiencing this fear and despair in specific locations within her body. And I think that shows, these feelings aren't just in our head. They're real, they're physical. And it seems like they're very deeply ingrained in her.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just like a fleeting feeling. It's something that she's, carrying within her on a very physical level.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. The facilitator asks about the depth of these emotions. And Eugenia's inner landscape is described as this vast, profound inner being. And, even her sadness and longing, only occupy like a fraction of this capacity. I mean, what a powerful image.
It's incredible, right? I mean, it suggests that there's this, immense potential within her, this, almost like an inherent resilience, because even with these difficult emotions present, they don't define her entirely. It's like this vast reservoir where, even significant distress is still, relatively small compared to the overall capacity. So it really points to this,
Yeah.
Fundamental strength that she has.
Yet despite this inner strength, the transcript points out that she can't just release this despair and fear.
Yeah.
She's tried consciously, through those, external pursuits, and she's done some personal work, but it hasn't really been enough to shift these deeper feelings. What do you think that is?
Well, I think sometimes, those really deep-seated emotions, they can be locked in place by, subconscious beliefs or past experiences that, maybe the conscious mind can't even really access. It's almost like trying to get rid of a weed by just pulling on the leaves. You have to address the root system.
Yeah.
And that's where I think hypnotic regression can be so powerful.
Yeah, and then we see this moment where she makes a decision to release these emotions. And what follows is really interesting. It's almost like a period of thought or detachment.
Yeah.
What do you think might be happening in that moment?
Yeah, it's possible that detachment is like a necessary buffer. It's a way for her system to kind of process and release these emotions without, being totally overwhelmed by them.
Yeah.
And it could also suggest that there's like a shift in perspective, like she's no longer identifying with these emotions as being, inherently her.
Right. And then after that, her subtle self is described as being delicate and fragile, which contrasts with, her physical self. I mean, that's a pretty stark contrast. What do you think that suggests?
It might point to like a vulnerability at her core, maybe like a sensitivity that hasn't been nurtured or protected, and that contrast with her physical self, could suggest that maybe she's, putting up this stronger exterior while her inner world is, much more tender.
And then there's this really key point where she's asked, what's bothering her, and her subtle self can't identify a specific external cause. She's surrounded by her life, but she can't point to one thing that's making her feel this unease. I mean, it's huge.
It is, right? Because it really suggests that the root of the distress, is internal, and it could be anything. It could be unresolved past experiences or, ingrained beliefs, or even just this sense of something being missing that's not even tied to her current circumstances. It makes you really wonder what that piece could be.
And then that leads into this exploration of, where is this longing coming from?
Yeah.
And guided by the regression. It appears that it's connected to the departure of someone very close to her, her husband, and her inability to accept this loss is so strong that it's even been, perceived by others as a psychological issue, So it's not just like a general longing, it's specifically tied to this relationship.
Right. And the fact that, people were labeling her as psychologically unwell, because of this really speaks to the conflict between, her inner experience and the external reality, suggests that bond with her husband was very, very deep. And, to her, something just didn't feel right about his absence.
And this is where we get to the central and the really unbelievable part of this whole thing. Despite everyone believing that her husband was dead, Eugenia had this unshakable belief that he was not. Think about how strong that conviction must have been to go against, literally everyone else.
I mean, it's remarkable, right, to hold on to that belief so strongly, when everyone else is saying the opposite. It really speaks to the power of intuition and, just this inner knowing that we all have. It makes you wonder, how often should we really be trusting our gut feelings, even when, it contradicts what everyone else is saying?
And here's the unbelievable part. Through the regression, it's revealed that she was right. Her husband had faked his own death. I mean, it just completely reframes everything we've been talking about.
It does, right? What was initially perceived as, a psychological issue, her inability to accept reality turns out to be an accurate perception of what actually happened. It really makes you think about the power of our intuition and, how easily we can be swayed by these external narratives.
And the transcript goes into, the husband's motivations, and it turns out he really wanted to live a different life in this, attractive coastal town. And it's almost like his wife's contentment and rootedness in their current life, fueled this desire because he felt like he couldn't convince her to move.
Hmm.
I mean, it's kind of a messed up motivation.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely highlights, the selfishness that can sometimes drive our actions, and even though, seeking personal fulfillment is understandable, his actions cause so much pain to the people around him.
Yeah. And the way he staged his death is just crazy. I mean, he used the accidental death of another man. He bribed people involved, disguised the body, hid it so it would be discovered later. I mean, the level of planning is just wild.
It's disturbing, right? It
Yeah.
really speaks to, the lengths that he was willing to go to, to create this new life for himself and, the disregard that he had for, the people who loved him.
And as you can imagine, the aftermath is, widespread grief. Everyone believes he's dead except for Eugenia.
Yeah.
I mean, this just emphasizes how alone she must have felt in her truth.
Right. And, I think it shows how convincing, those external appearances can be, because everyone had what seemed like, undeniable proof, so her
Right.
disbelief, probably seemed, completely irrational to everyone else.
And that's where this isolation becomes so heartbreaking, because she's holding on to this truth while being surrounded by, everyone telling her she's wrong. I mean, imagine that internal conflict.
Yeah. It must have been incredibly damaging, to her mental and emotional well-being, to just constantly be told that you're wrong about something that you so deeply believe to be true. It's a classic example of this conflict between, individual intuition and collective belief.
Yeah, the transcript even compares it to, someone who believes in UFOs
Yeah.
or, a detective sensing that someone's innocent, even when the evidence says otherwise.
Mm.
You know, it shows that sometimes this inner conviction can be so strong, even without external validation. And in her case, it turned out to be accurate.
Right. And I think that's such a great analogy because, we've all had those moments, where we feel so strongly about something and no one else agrees, and it's like Eugenia's experience shows that sometimes that inner knowing, can be true even when it hasn't been revealed yet.
And the potential consequences for her were huge.
Yeah.
There was this possibility of being institutionalized, being put on medication. And it's just so ironic that the very interventions that were supposed to help her, could have actually made her seem even more unwell.
It's tragic, right? Her intuition was basically pathologized and the help that she was supposed to be getting, could have actually pushed her further away from her own truth.
Now let's contrast that with her husband's life. He's living in this coastal town with a new family, new identity,
Yeah.
and it seems like he's happy. But, there's this constant fear of being discovered, and he has, guilt and longing for his first family, so it's not like he got away scot-free.
Right. It's like, his decision, while it, brought him some level of, external happiness, it created these new anxieties and burdens, the fear of being caught, like the guilt that he was carrying.
Yeah.
It suggests that he never really escaped, the consequences of his actions.
Yeah, and he's so careful to avoid detection. He changes his appearance. He avoids going anywhere near his old home. I mean,
Yeah.
that just shows how precarious this new life that he built is. He's constantly looking over his shoulder.
Yeah, it's like he's living in this, this false reality, and even though he's achieved his desires on the outside, that internal strain of keeping up the deception, and the connections that he suffered, those
Yeah.
are always going to be there.
And the transcript makes it clear that, his decision wasn't based on hatred, for Eugenia or his children.
Yeah.
It was purely selfish.
Mm.
He wanted this life for himself, and even though he missed them, he was willing to leave them behind.
Right. It's like it wasn't even about escaping, a bad situation. It was just this desire for something that he perceived as better,
Yeah.
and he was willing to hurt the people he loved to get it.
And there's even this idea that, maybe there were some external influences, in his decision, like
Yeah.
subconscious encouragement from people in the town he moved to or the environment itself. It makes you think about how much our surroundings can affect us.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that our decisions, are never made in this, completely isolated bubble. The environment that we're in, the energy of the people around us, those can all play a role in shaping our desires.
And going back to their relationship, both of them were described as free spirits early on, and it makes you wonder what changed.
It does, right? Maybe their paths just diverged,
Mhm.
and he still wanted, this constant change and new experiences while she, was seeking more stability, and I think that that difference in their needs could have definitely contributed to his unhappiness.
Now, when we get to the end of Eugenia's life, in the regression. It's described as a state of incapacitation. She's dulled by medication, and she's still filled with longing. And it's almost like an echo of her initial state.
Yeah.
But it's just so much more intense because of the suppression of her truth.
It's really sad, right? Because it shows the impact of not being believed and, the potential harm of these, interventions that don't take into account a person's inner reality, and it's like that longing just never left her. And it was probably even amplified by the fact that, she was being told she was wrong.
And then we move into the interlife state, after death. And Eugenia's experience is described as this somber plane, with all these distressed figures. And she's reluctant, but there's also this sense of necessity and like a faint hope. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, this is often seen as like a transitional realm, where the soul kind of processes everything that happened in the previous life, and I think that reluctance, probably comes from the pain that she's carrying. But, that glimmer of hope suggests that, there's still this movement towards healing.
Yeah, and then her next incarnation is shown as this young girl who's highly sensitive, very emotional, and has this, hidden fragility. It makes you think that some things are being carried over.
Right. And it aligns with this idea of karma, that the soul kind of carries these, lessons and sensitivities from past lives. And, it's possible that, her heightened sensitivity in this new life is a direct result of, everything she went through as Eugenia.
Well, when we come back to the present day, Eugenia, after seeing all of this, she's filled with deep sadness and loneliness. These past experiences are still very much with her.
Yeah. And I think it just highlights how enduring the impact of past lives can be. Whether we remember them or not, those feelings and experiences can still resonate within us and influence our present.
And then the regression looks into the esoteric reasons,
Yeah.
for some of her lifelong struggles. She's shy, sensitive, she has self-doubt, she's distrustful, and all of these are linked to past life experiences where, she was basically shut down and her desires were suppressed, and this really affected her confidence.
Yeah, it's a common theme, when we're looking at past lives, those experiences of being silenced or punished, they can create these deep patterns of insecurity and hesitation that carry forward into our next lives. It's almost like we learn these lessons of self-protection that become these, ingrained habits.
And because of those past experiences,
Mm-hmm.
She has trouble expressing her opinions.
Mm-hmm.
It's like she's still anticipating those negative reactions.
Right. She learned that it wasn't safe to express herself, and, that memory is still affecting her today.
And they explore her nervousness, and it's attributed to, these suppressed emotions.
Yeah.
The disconnect from her desired reality, which we now know was the truth about her husband.
Yeah.
This subconscious sense of threat and this internal struggle,
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot.
It is. Imagine carrying all of that within you. It's no wonder she was experiencing so much anxiety.
And her lack of concentration, her memory issues, they're linked to, her mind being consumed by this emptiness, this loneliness, this longing.
Yeah.
It's like her inner world is so loud that it's drowning out the present moment.
Yeah. When we're preoccupied with these, unresolved emotions and that sense of something missing, it takes so much of our energy and focus. It makes sense that it would affect her concentration and memory.
Okay, so now we have this clear picture of, the emotional and energetic burdens that she's carrying, and the session moves into this process of releasing them. She feels the strongest emotions in her chest, stomach, and head, for sadness, longing, a feeling of burden, nausea, and pressure. That mind-body connection is so apparent.
It is, right? Our emotions are not separate from our bodies. And I think it's so powerful to be able to identify those specific locations, as a first step in releasing them.
And she symbolically removes these feelings, she kind of discards them. And then she identifies this energetic entity that was seemingly amplifying her sadness and longing.
Oh.
I think the idea of external energetic influences is really fascinating.
It is. And, it's a concept that shows up in a lot of spiritual traditions, and whether we see them as literal external forces or just representations of, negative patterns within ourselves, removing them can really create a shift.
And she also removes, thought patterns that are contributing to her detachment and rumination, and her hearing loss and tinnitus are connected to the energy in her head. It suggests that some physical ailments might have an energetic component.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a key principle in a lot of healing modalities, that these energetic imbalances can manifest as physical symptoms, and it's possible that by releasing that energy, her hearing could improve.
And then it continues. She removes non-belonging energies from different parts of her body. including one that was affecting her grounding. I mean, it seems like a very thorough cleansing process.
It is. She's addressing not just specific emotions, but these, broader energetic imbalances. And, working on grounding can be so important, to help us feel more present and connected.
And after all of that, she's described as being in this pensive state, just taking it all in.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. After such a major energetic clearing, her system needs time to adjust.
And then she has to see who placed these energies on her. And this is where it gets really interesting. These tall, hooded figures appear, and they transform into these slender, dark reptilian beings. But her reaction is neutral. What do you think these figures might represent?
Well, in some esoteric traditions, reptilian beings are associated with, manipulation and control, but in the context of regression, they could also just be symbols of her own fears, or limiting beliefs, or even those internalized patterns of control that she's now confronting. And I think her neutral reaction is really key here. It suggests that she's not afraid of them.
And then it explores the hierarchy
Yeah.
behind these beings, and it turns out they're serving this higher entity, described as this king-like figure who embodies authority, and she recognizes him as well. So there's this whole other layer of potential influence.
Yeah, it sounds like, there's this complex system at play, with different levels of, manipulation or control. And, but the fact that she recognizes this higher entity, makes me wonder if there's some connection to, maybe authority figures in her life.
And then we get to this really powerful turning point. She declares that she's taking control of her life. She's not going to be manipulated anymore.
It's such an important step, right? It's like she's reclaiming her power. She's deciding that she's not going to be a victim anymore.
And then she examines her energetic and karmic connections. And there are over 1,000 of them, but she has this vague sense of familiarity with them, So it seems like these are connections to people she's known.
Yeah, and that sense of familiarity is interesting, because it suggests that these aren't like, these malevolent attachments, they're just energetic ties,
Right.
To people she's interacted with, and, clearing them could help her release those old patterns.
And the transcript mentions that, the effects of past suppression and medication are cleared, and it confirms that her former husband is one of these connections. He's still alive in his current life, and they haven't met in this lifetime. So even without physical contact, that energetic link is there.
Right. Energetic connections can last for lifetimes, especially when there are, unresolved issues or strong emotions, and I think clearing those effects of suppression and medication is so important, because it helps her return to her natural state.
And she telepathically communicates her realizations to her husband, and he's overwhelmed by it. Imagine being on the receiving end of that.
Right. I mean, it must have been a lot to process, and it probably brought up a lot of guilt and, maybe even some subconscious recognition of, the truth and the pain that he caused.
And then she does something pretty amazing. She severs the energetic connection with him and anyone else who doubted her,
Yeah.
but she leaves open the possibility of inspiration for them. It's like she's setting boundaries, but she's still compassionate.
It is, right? She's not
Yeah.
shutting them out completely, but she's taking control of her own energy, and that's so important for healing.
And it's emphasized that, this clearing is complete. She's released the resentment, the longing, the need to search and wait. I mean, that's got to feel incredible.
It does. It's like she's finally free from the weight of the past.
And she sends this message to the reptilian beings, like, that she's changing the rules
Yeah.
and she's taking control. It's like she's reclaiming her sovereignty.
Right. She's letting them know that she's not going to be controlled anymore.
And then they address her chest pains, and they're attributed to the emotional burdens that she's been carrying. And they point out that they briefly went away after her daughter's session, which was like a sign that she didn't fully grasp.
Yeah, it's fascinating how our bodies can give us those clues, right?
Yeah.
But the fact that the pain came back, shows that there was still more work to be done.
And her recent sleepless night, with racing thoughts and pressure in her head, that was apparently caused by the removed energies,
Yeah.
Trying to undermine her progress,
Yeah.
like they were fighting back.
Yeah, that can definitely happen, when we're making these big energetic shifts, it's like these old patterns trying to hold on.
And lastly, they talk about her lack of close female friends, and it's connected to past experiences of being misunderstood. So she built up this wall to protect herself, and then she releases that limiting belief.
Right. And I think that that's something so many people can relate to. We get hurt and we build up these walls, and it's important to remember that, we can always choose to let them down.
And then she commands all external entities to leave her space,
Yeah, well,
and her energy is flowing freely again.
it's like she's back in her natural state.
Yeah.
Her energy isn't being blocked or influenced anymore.
And her subtle self communicates that she needs more mental stimulation, more movement,
Hmm.
not just physical, but intellectual. Yeah. It's a good reminder that, we need to take care of both our minds and bodies.
Absolutely. It's all connected.
And it's mentioned that, there have been some physical changes that could support her hearing, recovering, and her subtle self clears toxins and makes a conscious decision to regenerate her cells. It's amazing how powerful our intentions can be.
It really is, and I think it shows the potential for, our inner work to create real physical healing.
And at the end, there are no trauma imprints in her cellular memory. She has self-acceptance, safety, trust. Her current state is described as light, calm, balanced, highly conscious, and aware of her true self. She's complete, and her subtle self is happy and ready to fully embody herself, without the weight of the past. I mean, wow, what a transformation.
It's incredible, right? It just shows the profound healing is possible.
So for me, this deep dive into Eugenia's regression, it's about so much more than just, the shocking truth about her husband. It's about releasing those burdens, those influences, and, reclaiming her power. And I think it really makes us think about, those times in our own lives where our inner knowing clashed with what everyone else was telling us.
Yeah. It makes you wonder, what hidden truths are we carrying? What can we discover if we dare to explore those deeper levels of ourselves?
Exactly.
Right.
So to you, our listener, think about those times when you felt that disconnect.
Yeah.
What truths might be hidden within your own experiences.
Mm.
Could exploring those unconventional sources, lead to your own profound realizations. It's definitely something to ponder.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great place to leave it, with that question for our listeners.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us on another deep dive. We will see you next time.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.